much, Joan. Well, I've got a slide advance, I think. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll manage without it in that case. I think otherwise I'll have two gadgets and get confused. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you all again, and it's great to see so many people here. And it's great to see the exhibition here. I'm really pleased there's a time to have another look at it. I think it is the most fantastic exhibition. It really, I think, conveys, in a way, I think better than any other exhibition of finds that I've seen from test pitting, kind of what the test pitting's all about and how it works. The way you've got the pictures, the maps and the finds all laid out. For anyone who wasn't involved in the test pit digging, I think it makes it very clear how it works. And also, give you an idea, if you haven't had a test pit in your garden yet, just what might be under there. And looking at the finds there, you can see how easy those objects would be to miss. You're just gardening and not really thinking about it. And the great joy of the process is, the great joy of the process is the way all the little bits and pieces build up into being something really big. And it is like pieces of jigsaw puzzle. So every tiny little fragment, every teaspoonful of soil that gets moved, and there's been quite a lot of teaspoonfuls of soil moved with 32 pits, every ounce of effort makes a difference, and it all builds up into this bigger picture. And you now have the most fantastic picture of what lies underneath Meldreth. So I'm not intending to talk for a hugely long period of time this afternoon, and I'm not even going to attempt to go through all of the test pits in turn. There's absolutely no point me showing you a load of pictures of it when you've got all the finds laid out here. If you haven't had a good look at the exhibition, do that and see what's turned up. So I'm going to talk really about the results of the community archaeological excavations here in Meldreth, and also try to put them into a slightly wider context for you. As many of you know, the original aim of the project was, and this is a direct quote from the original application to the Heritage Lottery Fund, who of course have funded all the digging here, to explore how the community developed and evolved through the digging of 20 to 30 test pits in different locations, involving the wider community, asking them to participate. We'll share our findings in a number of ways. During the project, we'll build up skills and experience so that we can continue to explore our heritage once the project's been completed. And I think this project has succeeded fantastically well in all of those aims. And that's been due to the way you have all engaged with it, and of course in the way that the key members of Meldreth History Society put in a huge amount of work, and I can't even begin to think about how much work must have been involved in putting this exhibition together. We were involved from the university as Cambridge Community Heritage, which is a project funded by one of the research councils to help community groups put these applications together. And you can see Joan and Kath sitting with me in a meeting in Cambridge 18 months ago now, sort of talking over initial ideas. The Meldreth proposal was successful. 90% of the groups we worked were actually successful in their applications compared to 50% nationwide. So I think having more heads, more advice, more thoughts, more different ideas on the project really helped get successful projects. And we were then funded by one of the research councils to provide training, support and advice to the groups as needed. And we've got, well, you'll recognise some of the faces here coming in for a pottery identification day, which proved to be extremely useful because you turned up an awful lot of pottery. There were lots of different ways that you could all get involved. You could dig a test pit in your own garden, you could offer your garden to somebody else to come and dig it, or you could go and dig a pit in somebody else's garden, or the most vital role of all in many respects is providing refreshments. One of the great things about a project like this is it brings everyone together. It is hard work, but it should be enjoyable as well. So it is a chance for the community to come together, both to dig and to enjoy the results of that. And of course, everyone's been involved in spreading the word, getting people involved. So a total of 32 test pits were dug. Here's a map of the village showing that they go from right at the very south end of the village, right up through it to the north. It's a very long village, And in fact, yesterday I had a meeting, we had an event yesterday in Cambridge with all of the different groups that we've worked with this year and some other groups who would like to do projects in the future. And there's a group from Cumbria who had come all the way down to talk to us about ideas for doing test pit digging. They said, we've got a very long village, and I said, talk to the Meldreth. But as you can see, there was fantastic success in getting test pits throughout the village. Now, always is the way with these things, of course, you start to think, oh, there's gaps. And I'll leave the thought of the gaps for you to think about what you want to do with that in the future. But generally, there's a good spread. We started off with a talk in here. I was terribly impressed with the beautiful shiny labels on the brand new digging equipment. Your mattocks were considerably better state than ours were when we started off. And then went out and got digging, of course. Another great thing about the Meldreth project was the number of test pits that were open for people to come in and visit. And it was great to walk around the village and see signs saying test pit open and come in and have a look round. And there were several different weekends of digging and several other projects as well involving schools. So it was a great opportunity to draw as many different people in as possible and involve everyone who could possibly want to be involved. The first test pit I visited, we had 3 separate weekends and some other digging, so I wasn't here for all of them, so we sort of juggled people around, was up at the pub. Always a favourite test pit, of course, the one with a pub. Not, I think, rewarded by some of the most prolific finds. Very different was, I'm just going to literally talk about 3 or 4 of the pits that kind of grabbed my attention in particular. Test pit 7, as it was in the first weekend in Flambards Close here. And it's a wonderful example, this really, of never assume that the age of the houses will tell you anything about the date of what turns up under the ground. Obviously it's a relatively modern close of houses now. 2 test pits in the middle of the lawn area there, which turned up the most fantastic range of medieval pottery. Masses and masses of high medieval pottery, 12th, 13th, 14th century. And for all of the pottery, we sent it off to pottery specialists, who some of you will know from watching Time Team, a person called Paul Blinkhorn. He's the big shaven-headed Liverpudlian guy with the tattoos and the motorbike. But he is absolutely passionate and extremely knowledgeable about the sort of post-Roman pottery. So here we've got the pottery from test pit 7, and there's a report, a table like this for every single one of the test pits. And there's a copy of several copies of the report here. So if you want to know the nitty-gritty of what turned up in your test pit, have a look at that. So the initials here, that's St Neots, and Shelley-coated ware, early medieval ware, Headingham ware, Harlow grey ware, Hufford's grey ware, I think. Mill green, late medieval transitional Victorian. Test pits number 7 all the way down, context number 1, number 2, number 3. You'll remember, those of you involved in the digging, that your test pit was dug in a series of 10 centimetre contexts with the finds from each context kept separately so that you can see how things change over time. And these different sorts of pottery is listed by the number of sherds and the weight of all of the sherds of that type from each layer. And by laying it out like this, you can start to see how the pottery coming from that test pit changed as you got further down, because this went down to context 8 to 80 centimetres. And what's interesting, you see there's very little Victorian. Typically, most of the test pits turned up quite a lot of Victorian or 20th century, the kind of white, shiny china that we'd recognise quite easily. And again, have a look around the exhibition when I finish talking to see how many of the pits did turn up lots of the Victorian and modern material in the upper layers, but very little from here. Very little late medieval, just a couple of sherds of that. Mill green's quite specialised, don't get a great deal of that anyway. But as you can see, there's a huge amount sort of clustering in the middle here. A lot of the Hertfordshire grey ware here. This is sort of basic utilitarian cooking stuff. This is what a lot of this material is. Well, it's called grey ware because it's grey. Pottery specialists are generally very unimaginative when it comes up with names. So it's called Hertfordshire Greyware because it comes from Hertfordshire's grey. Paul tells me he once put up, was it him or somebody else, Chris Cumberpatch, one of the pottery specialists, they were convinced that nobody ever reads pottery reports from archaeological excavations, and they actually included in the description list that accompanies any report custard-coloured crikey-ware. Nobody's ever queried it. But that would be much more imaginative. But you can see how much is turning up. 4 sherds from context 1, 26 of this from 2, 17 from context 3, 19 from context 4, 6, 7 and 20. And on the same date is the Headingham ware and the early medieval wares here as well. So these are all that same sort of date, all spanning the period between about 1100 and 1400. And this is a huge amount of pottery to turn up. They're only 1 metre squares. And normally we would say if you get 5 sherds or more of pottery of any one sort of medieval date, then we will be fairly confident saying, there's somebody living here. That's only 5 sherds. And you can see there's actually much, much more of this date. So there's, altogether, there must be about 50 sherds of that general high medieval date from that. Even more interestingly, we had earlier material as well. And what is interesting here is you can see, because there's no later stuff, this tells us that these layers are likely to be undisturbed. So that means that everything else coming from that layer is likely to date to that same period. So I will come back to that. But we can see there's not a lot of Victorian material. It doesn't look as if people have been digging that over. What we've also got down here is some St Neots ware going back to the late Anglo-Saxon period. Well, it spans 900 to 1100, but on the sort of balance of probability, there's only 50 years of that after the, 40 years after that, after the Norman Conquest. So it's more likely to be before the Norman Conquest, and there's nothing later with it either. If it was mixed in with these early medieval wares, we might think it was at the later post-Norman Conquest end of that. So we've got a couple of sherds of late Anglo-Saxon pottery there, so it suggests that site is going right back to that date. Because this is looking very, it's certainly a medieval occupation site. It's supposedly the site of Flambard's Manor, and very, very rarely, and I cannot stress enough how uncommon a find like this is. This is the find that Kath was mentioning a minute ago. It's made of copper alloy. It would have been sort of shiny, sort of coppery colour when it was new. We've never found one of these from a test pit before. In fact, we have so much never found one from a test pit before that everyone misidentified it, including the person from the Portable Antiquities scheme, Helen Geeks, who again many of you will have seen on Time Team. When I gave it to her to look at, I said I think we found a pilgrim badge, because this is exactly what it looks like. It looks like the sort of thing that you would pick up if you'd been on pilgrimage, buy as a souvenir, or even as a sort of demonstration of the fact that you've been on pilgrimage, so you can show off to other people. It looks exactly like this. The decoration on it, when we looked at it carefully, it's the crucifixion. So you've got, you appreciate it's difficult to see this at a distance, so I won't linger on it too long, but that's Jesus' head, basically. That's one arm of the cross. There is a sun up there, or possibly a halo. That's one of his arms, and this is just sort of tapering down to his waist and his legs just down here. There is a figure that's missing here that would have been Virgin Mary, and a hint of another figure here who doesn't ever seem to have had a very complete body. This is definitely the sort of item you would not expect from a peasant household. It's not sort of a royal exotic item, it's not made of gold, it doesn't suggest there's royalty living here, but it's absolutely right for gentry, as it were, you're sort of lord of the manor. And it's this that tells us really more than anything else that we really have got the site of Flambard's Manor there, and even more importantly, that the archaeology from that site is undisturbed in that area. And that's really interesting, because we've got nothing later. We're confident that it's reasonably undisturbed, apart from the odd tree root and things like that, that we've got an undisturbed archaeological site there. So value it, because it's precious and unusual, and there might even be remains of buildings. You might, if you did a bigger dig there, it might be possible to reconstruct the lines of buildings. You might find walls or post holes or something like that. So it's potentially really quite an important site there. When I gave this to Helen, she initially, poor Catherine Joe kept getting these reports back from me saying, oh, we think it's this. Helen was initially saying she thought she couldn't find any parallels for it in England. I thought initially it looked a bit like Walsingham ones, pilgrim badges, which it does, but it doesn't match closely enough. And they're fairly standardised, these things. Helen then said the only parallel she could find was from the Low Countries, so that sounded very exciting. And then we suddenly got a complete turnaround. She said she found a perfect match for it. And it's this, and you can see this comes from Billingsgate in London. It's the only other example that's exactly like this, but it is a perfect match. It's mould perfect. It has come out of the same mould. You can actually, you can see how much, you can see it much better here. So there's Jesus' head quite clearly, there's the cross, there's Virgin Mary. You can see the sort of knees together, sort of twisted slightly to one side. You can see that this figure, which probably in the original design of the mould was intended to be a little more entire, but is broken off here in the same way that it's broken off there. There's the halo or the sun. Every single detail is absolutely identical, including the decoration around the edge. And what is also, you can see, which does it again, it's easier to see on this example, there is an inscription around that which says Jesus. Which again, is really nice to have a readable inscription. And what this is it's a mirror case. And as you can see, it's hinged at this end. There's a very similar picture on the other side, so it would have been an openable mirror. The mirror would have been made of convex glass backed with lead, which would provide with a silvery reflection. And the convex shape of the glass would have given you as big an image as possible. The item itself is very small. You'll see it's about 4 centimetres in diameter. So it's a very small mirror. As Helen said to me, she said, well, it was the sort of thing you might check your makeup with, or you're tweezing your eyebrows or whatever. You wouldn't check it to make sure you put your trousers on, she said. It is a really nice domestic item though. It's expensive, it's unusual. This is the only other example in captivity. This is the only other known example in the world of this. There's a couple of other examples from Billingsgate, similar-ish sort of things, but these two, in terms of being identical, are the only two known, and they're uncommon items anyway. So there's something quite special going on in Meldreth on that site that we've got this find from. So this will, we need to get it conserved. I brought it back today so you can see it. The identification has only just happened. I know you probably think that this is taking an awfully long time to get this done, but it does take a bit of time to get people free to look. It was a challenge, so you set us something quite difficult on that. But as you can see, it's very clear, and that's exactly what we've got. Now you can even see the hinges, the hinge fittings there match perfectly.
Is that the bottom of the same mould?
Yes, yes. I think. What is it? The same mould? No, I don't think so. Actually, I think they're probably two separate ones. No, I think probably the fittings are slightly different. The other really weird thing we had from the same test pit was this. It's a bead, as you can see. It looks like a cough sweet, but it isn't. I'm sure. This, again, from test pit 7, context 5. So if we go back to the pottery report again, we can see that context 5 only got medieval pottery in it, spanning, well, 11 to 1200, very tight date range. This object, though, doesn't look medieval, and this is very bizarre, and I think what we need to do with this is send it up to somebody either in the Fitzwilliam Museum or the British Museum. We've been looking at that, Helen and I have had a look at this. It should be medieval. It comes from a medieval lair. It's very secure. There's no later material with it. but it looks too finely made. It doesn't look like sort of medieval gemstones that you find in jewellery. It was initially, we thought it might be amber. Somebody else has had a look at it now and suggests it's probably carnelian, which is a sort of semi-precious stone. I'm rather pleased about that because I remember finding a carnelian in a sort of gravel pit when I was about 9. So I have a sort of, my parents made it into a piece of jewellery for me, so I'm rather attached to carnelian. So, and it certainly that would fit quite, it's very hard and it doesn't sort of feel quite like amber. But it doesn't, the shape of it and the bevelling doesn't look medieval. So that's bizarre. So with your permission, I'd quite like to take that away and get someone to have a look at it. It maybe it's an unusual example of it as a medieval bead, but generally we find medieval gems in settings, they're smoothed around. You know, you look at it like that and you think it's going to be Victorian or 20th century. What our theory is at the moment is that it is a victim of either worms or rabbits or tree roots, and it is something, because it's very, as you can see, it's very small. This is a centimetre, here, so it's barely a centimetre across. It is very small. It could conceivably have been carried down into a lower layer by something like a tree root that's either pushed something down or created a hollow when it rots away, or a wormhole or a rabbit hole. And I'm very aware as I stand here saying this, that this sounds very much like special pleading. Everything else from that layer is medieval, but it doesn't look like it's medieval. So we're still puzzled by that. If it does turn out to be medieval, then you've really got something very interesting again. And of course it would fit with the mirror case. So I don't have a final verdict on that at the moment, I'm afraid, but it is underlining what an interesting, exciting site you've got there. And of course it again raises that, well, what on earth else is going on there? Do look after that site. Another test pit that was a really nice one was test pit 10, which was one of 2 that was dug right down in the centre of the village at the farm shop. This was a very impressive dig. It was done incredibly quickly by the team that dug this. Most of you are more used to metal detecting than digging, but no, nonetheless got it done incredibly quickly. Again, you can see the pottery report here, and you can see the photographs of the finds, all of which are here anyway. And this produced quite a lot of Roman material going on down, so very different to test pit 7. Test pit 7 didn't produce any Roman material, though if it had got deeper, it might have done, we don't know. This did produce quite a lot of Roman material. As you can see, 7 sherds of Roman, so that's well over the 5 sherds sort of horizon, if you like. And even 2 sherds is more than you expect from just manuring. So we've got a hint there of the Roman material there. You can see in the finds here, we've got some sort of relatively recent stuff from context 2, and then going further down we've got older material, and there's a couple of the sherds of Roman material from from context 5. Doesn't look particularly eye-catching on the whole. Another test pit I wanted to comment on was test pit 23, which produced, it was one of several which produced a lot of prehistoric pottery. And this is, again, incredibly unusual. And I know it sounds like I keep saying it's all very unusual, but Meldreth has turned up a lot of things that are very uncommon. Generally, we find very little prehistoric pottery in the test pitting. There isn't a great deal of it around anyway. It's not used as much. There aren't the population's not as high. People aren't using as much pottery, and it's fairly soft and difficult to see often, so it is kind of small and will, sometimes it's actually not very hard fired and will almost crumble away anyway, and it can be easy to miss. You've got 11 sherds of it from one test here, and again you can see, if you look right along the line for both context 6 and context 7, there's no later material at all. So here again we seem to have undisturbed layers of prehistoric occupation dating to somewhere between 1200 and 800 BC. Again, intact. If that was a bigger area opened up there, you might well find post holes from buildings, or possibly something like a cremation burial or something like that from sites like that. And interestingly, in upper layers we actually have bits of worked flint as well. So this is context 3, which, as you can see, it doesn't have any of the prehistoric pottery, but it does have a couple of bits of worked flint that may well have been brought up by digging there. Again, Roman pottery as well. Test bit 28 is, I wasn't here when this one was about, all of these high 20s ones, I was away, which clearly you do much better when I'm not on site. Masses of material came from several of the pits. I came back to have sort of accounts, god-like accounts by my colleagues who were here while you were digging then of this huge amount of material that turned up. You can see again, and this is right up in the north of the village, Bronze Age pottery again, a couple of dozen sherds of that. I don't think we've ever had a test pit that's produced that much pottery. We've had entire counties where we've done 300 or 400 test pits that haven't produced that much pottery. Somebody did some statistical analysis and worked out that you are 25,000 times more likely to find Victorian pottery than Bronze Age. It's that uncommon. If you look at this, you've got one sherd of Victorian and a couple of dozen probably of the prehistoric. So again, something really special going on here. A little bit of Roman material, and then masses of this St Neots ware, this pottery sort of spans 9 to 1100, generally late Anglo-Saxon, going all the way down. We've clearly got an important late Anglo-Saxon site with masses of pottery turning up there. And carrying on through the medieval period again, lots and lots here, and then stopping fairly much the juddering halt in terms of the pottery deposition, sometime round about, probably as early as 1200 by the looks of it, maybe a little bit later. So really remarkably little going on in the later period up there. And then test bit 29, another site, again, no Roman here, so a much bigger break between, again, white. I mean, for any other site, 5 sherds of Bronze Age would be outstanding. For Meldreth, it starts to look like, oh, it's just another one of them. But as you can see, quite a break here in the Roman, a little bit of St Neots, and then again picking up in this high medieval period with very much less later material. Test bit 29, also notable. The pottery reports are usually fairly sort of, basic, really. They don't go into a great deal of flowery detail about stuff. It's a factual account of what's there. But Paul, who did the report, drew particular attention to the Surrey whiteware that turned up here, and I put the class description of this in here, the white or buff-coloured pottery, so you can see some bits of it sitting down there, often with a bright green glaze. It's a very rare find in this area. So I put this in because I keep saying this about things being rare in this area. This is what Paul's saying, suggesting this, this is being made down sort of Kingston-on-Thames, that sort of area. This has come from quite a long way away, again hinting at a higher status site, so a very different part of the village, of course, so probably manorial site again up there. In the archaeology, again with no late disturbance, so again intact archaeology down there. Those layers with the pottery in are getting intact remains of other sorts as well. Okay, so that's just a few highlights, and as I say, all of this is here, and it's much more interesting for you to go and have a look at it and have me describe it. But what I do want to do is think about a little bit about how all this comes together and what this is telling us about the development or the history of the village today in the past. So this is the pottery, the Bronze Age pottery, and as you can see we've got several sites that are producing large amounts of it. So for all of these maps, the white squares are sites of test pits, and the circles are the sites of test pits that have produced pottery of any given date. So this is the Bronze Age. So we can see here, up at the mill site, we've got those huge assemblages there. The circle's only, 5 is as big as it gets. We never, don't normally find as many as 5, but you can see very definitely there's a cluster there, and in fact the test pit in the neighbouring garden there has actually produced a small sherd as well. So there's clearly a settlement, possibly even something like a cremation burial there, because there was quite a lot of burnt bone, which was too fragmentary, too broken up into small pieces, to be possible to identify whether it's human or animal, but is likely to be to do with a cremation burial, whether it's human cremated remains or whether it's an animal that's been incorporated into that. So there may well be a disturbed cremation burial. There's no sign of anything intact there up in that area. And also what we've got is quite a feeling really of a scatter of little settlements along the edge of the river valley, interestingly favouring the sort of the west side of the valley here. But these are quite a long way apart, so we seem to have some sort of settlement, group of huts perhaps here, another one there, and perhaps another one there, scattered along the valley there. Really interesting, and again, very unusual. Interesting, there doesn't seem to be any of this material coming from around here, though the minute you start looking at the negative evidence, you're on slightly weaker ground, because they are only 1 metre squares, and if you put your test pit here rather than sort of over there, you could just miss something that's fairly small. And of course what you immediately start to think is, oh, we're going to go and do small test pits in those gaps and see what's going on here, for example. You could have an enormous great big Bronze Age town down here, which would be unusual, because you don't get towns in Bronze Age. But you do start to think, what's going on here? We only had this one test pit east of the railway line, and to be quite honest, I didn't expect that to turn up anything at all. Everyone was having a great time digging it. There was a wonderful atmosphere. I didn't really expect it to produce anything. But again, turned up masses of this Bronze Age pottery. Going forward, we haven't had any Iron Age pottery, slightly bizarrely. All the prehistoric pottery seems to be Bronze Age. Going forward into the Roman period, the 1st to 5th century AD, a good spread. We don't get a great deal of Roman pottery on the whole from our villages, as I'll show you in a moment. Interesting, there's quite a lot. This is down at the farm shop, as you can see, large amounts of it down there, and good scatters of it around here. And that same sort of areas, we have the prehistoric material as well, slightly less, spreading slightly out beyond the area of the edge of the stream. And again, this test pit here, in the garden of a relatively modern house, not the sort of place you'd think you'd expect to find any Roman ruins, but clearly a significant amount of Roman material here, and there's a sherd of it there, and a sherd there, and quite a lot from here. So it's starting to look as if there's something going on here in the Roman period in the way of human settlement of a reasonably substantial nature, but relatively little up in this area. There's a couple of pieces, well, one piece came from a test pit there, but considerably less than the south of the village there. Going forward from the Roman period, we had nothing dating to the early or middle Anglo-Saxon period, no handmade brass tempered wares, no Ipswich ware. So whatever is going on in the Roman period is quite a lot, and I suspect if you did some more digging here, you'd end up, you would find considerably more of that material. Whatever is going on there doesn't seem to continue, though it would again be interesting to do a bit more digging. One of the villages we've done a lot of test pit digging in is Purton, near Hitchin in Hertfordshire. Over 100 pits have been dug in Purton. They had dozens of them produced Roman pottery, but they had one pit produced one sherd of early Middle Anglo-Saxon ware. So, which is just tantalising really, because it tells us there's something going on there. People are clearly using pottery, but it looks as if the settlement collapsed. At the moment it looks the same thing here. So it's not until we get to the late Anglo-Saxon period, the 9th to the 11th century, that we see perhaps the village that we know today coming into existence for the first time, but in quite a different form. Again, there's a focus in this area. You can see there's a lot of the test pits around here are producing late Anglo-Saxon material. The sort of Roman focus down here doesn't seem to be continuing, and neither does the Roman focus in this area. The Anglo-Saxon settlement is very much focused along the sort of edge of the river side, and of course up here. These look like two quite discrete settlements at the moment. I think we've got a dispersed pattern of settlements. Perhaps a village in this area, perhaps around one manorial focus, and another manorial, lordly, family, if you like, focus up in this area. Going to the high medieval period, you've seen lots and lots of pictures of all these medieval grey wares, and you can see quite how much is turning up. Interestingly, this seems to be the time when this section of the village comes into existence, part of a new extension perhaps to the village in the High Medieval period. And whereas in the Anglo-Saxon period, if I go back here, this looks perhaps not a nucleated village, quite a sort of maybe just sort of farmsteads and homesteads loosely clustered. When we go to the High Medieval period, it's definitely looking very much like a nucleated village. There seems to be a gap here. There's less material turning up there. One or two of these pits were a little bit had to, you know, didn't produce pottery for reasons to do with modern disturbance and things like that. And again, you think, oh, we could do with another few there, just to confirm there definitely is nothing there. And of course, then we've got all of the pottery here and up here from the possible manorial sites up here, the sort of cluster up and down there, from the Clanbard site. Going into the late medieval period, I think we can see a marked contraction. You can see how much less pottery is turning up. If I just go back to the High Medieval again, and then on to the late medieval, you can see how, interestingly, there's a complete blank from all of these test pits here. This is the mill site up here. It's producing very little in that later date. But there's quite a lot still going on here. You can start to get a bit of a feeling perhaps for the sort of form of the village, perhaps a rather, again, dispersed sort of, not solid nucleated village that we see in the High Medieval period, more of a scatter of sites along sort of winding lanes perhaps coming up there. And then into the 16th to 18th century. I missed out that one, haven't I? Right, okay, yes. So this is the the late medieval period. Sorry about that. Again, to go back to the medieval period, this is the High Medieval period before the Black Death. This is the period after the Black Death, and again you can see that semblance, there is a lot less turning up. And there is this feeling of it sort of being scattered along the area. There's certainly considerably less coming from here, less turning up there, but generally just the feeling the village has been thinned out. What is, again, very unusual is when we look at this map, the 16th to 18th century, the reason I got it confused with the other one is because it's quite similar. Most of the villages we dig in, we get a marked acceleration, a marked increase in the volume of material that's turning up in the sort of 16th to the end of the 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, you're into sort of mass production of pottery, good long distance trade, lots of material turning up, and it's easy to spot. So we generally see a marked increase in the amount of pottery turning up, whereas actually in Meldreth, the post-medieval pattern is really quite similar to the late medieval, and it's not until the Victorian period that we start to get really nearly all of the pits turning up material, apart from odd examples like some of the Clanbard sites. To put that into wider context, the test pitting generally, as you can see, this is the summary that we wrote recently for publication on this. It was mostly Kath and Joe wrote this, I think. But as you can see, the artefacts have spanned a hugely wide period, nearly 3,000 years, and have involved lots and lots of people. But what we can also do is put that into an even wider context. So, from the university, my research area has always been medieval settlement, which used to very much focus on deserted sites. This is a map of all deserted villages known in England. But the work I've been doing recently has focused on what we call the currently occupied rural settlements, the places that people are still living in today, like Meldreth. It's an interesting area to do this in because it's an area where we have some deserted villages but not lots, and it's also an area of mixed settlement where we have some nucleated villages and some much more dispersed villages. And it's also an area, of course, where there's very high population densities in the 11th century. This is the data from the Domesday Book, and you can see that Eastern England, which is where we focus, is an area of very high population, but also with areas of very low population. So Eastern England is an area of lots of contrasts. This is a map showing all of the villages that we've done some digging in by the beginning of last year actually, so we've since then done Warberswick and Dawes Heath down here and several other sites that are not marked on here, and of course Meldreth. What we can do with this data is start to see how any individual site, and I'll use Meldreth as an example here, compares with regional averages. So you can actually now rank your village in comparison with everywhere else in the region. So this is the data for the Roman period. So this is showing the percentage of excavated pits which produce Roman material. Now 19% of the pits in Meldreth produced at least 2 sherds of Roman material. Remember I said that 2 sherds, even as few as 2 sherds, was more than you would expect in a 1 metre test pit from just manuring, suggests there were people living or doing something fairly intensive and focused nearby. Now, knowing that 19% of the Meldreth test pits produce Roman pottery doesn't tell you very much until you start to compare it to other sites. The regional average is 8%. So twice as many of your pits have produced, more than twice as many, have produced Roman pottery. And you can see, this is all the graphs for all the other villages where we've excavated at least 23 pits. It doesn't make much sense in villages where we've got much too few pits because you can't get a good overall pattern. So not all the sites we've worked on are here. And this is Meldreth coming in at 19%. So you can see quite how impressive that is. I don't have a graph for Bronze Age because it's so vanishingly small. On average, 2% of excavated pits produce prehistoric pottery. It's vanishingly low. So I don't have a graph. So what we get at Meldreth, well, I should think actually about 10 of them produce Bronze Age pottery, so that might be a third. You know, you'd have a graph where everyone else is down, sitting along the bottom, and Meldreth is somewhere up here. But for Roman period, you can see how Meldreth is comparing. The only places really that that are competing with it at all are Peakirk, which is up near Peterborough, is on the edge of the Car Dyke, which of course is a big Roman engineering works, communication, trade network, where we might expect to find a lot of Roman material. Wiverton, which is up near Blakeney on the Norfolk coast, again, trading place, and Long Melford, which many of you may well have seen in Michael Wood's Great British Story, where we did test pit digging there, found masses of Roman pottery. Melford, the village today, the town today, is obviously on top of a Roman town. And then there's Meldreth. So I don't know. I wouldn't say you're on top of a Roman town, but at the moment, you could put a bloody good argument, or a very good argument together to say you think you're on top of something really quite interesting going on in the Roman period. I'll just show you Long Melford as a comparison. So here you can see this is the map of all of the sites producing Roman pottery at Long Melford. You can see how they're very much clustering. It's a big old village, Long Melford. You can see how they're in this area, not up where the church is. That's where the existing church is at Long Melford. So, you know, there's a Roman road goes through Melford, and we found a bit of that. And you can see there's a big dense settlement. So a little bit different to the rather more strung out settlement perhaps you've got at Meldreth. But nonetheless, you've got that cluster in the centre of the village at Meldreth. And, you know, I think there's definitely something unusual and interesting going on. And one of the things that's been very striking is how few of the test pit we dig in the existing villages do turn up Roman pottery, which suggests there's a real disjuncture, a real break between the settlement pattern of the Roman period and the villages of today that mostly have medieval origins. Meldreth seems to be bucking that trend. So interesting. I just thought I'd show you the slightly later ones at Long Melford. No early or middle Anglo-Saxon pottery, and in the late Anglo-Saxon period, just a little bit from here, and this year, in fact, we had some right up near the church. So very similar pattern, you know, big Roman settlement, absolutely nothing in the Anglo-Saxon period. But different at Meldreth, of course, because you've got lots of late Anglo-Saxon material. Skip through the rest of Long Melford there. Okay, so this is the Anglo-Saxon data. 31% of the Meldreth pits produce late Anglo-Saxon pottery. Again, these are a couple of sherds of. The regional average is 11%. So you've got 3 times as much Anglo-Saxon pottery as one would expect on average. You can see that Long Melford has been cut right down to shape. I mean, you know, how the mighty fallen. If you look at Long Melford, has been sort of soaring up there, right down. And as you can see, Meldreth is actually top. Yeah. It's always nice to bring good news, isn't it? Again, really interesting. Really, really interesting. And we can look at this. Sorry, I'm blank on about that. This is looking at, if I ignore the key there. But what I've done here is put in the percentage of pits that produce late Anglo-Saxon pottery from all the sites we've dug on. So Purton had a lot, 29%. That was top. Castor, again, 30%. And of course now, Meldreth sitting in the middle here. What's interesting is how it's fitting a general pattern where actually most of the villages where we've got high percentages of test pits producing Anglo-Saxon pottery are in this sort of central Anglo-Saxon crescent, if you like, where today's villages are being founded in the Anglo-Saxon period in this area, whereas something very different is clearly going on in Essex, and South Suffolk perhaps, and by the looks of it in most of Fenland. Once you get away from Peakirk, which is sort of round about here, you can see Fenland has really very little turning up. So Meldreth is sitting in that general pattern, but does seem to be an extreme example of it, as I say at the moment. You'll top on that. It's just showing again where this, if we look for the most, the pits are producing the places are producing the highest percentage. Again, this is central area, which again has Meldreth sitting there. Bizarrely, Ashwell produce actually no pits have two. I think we found one sherd of Anglo-Saxon pottery from Ashwell, and that's it. Despite Ashwell being described in the Domesday Book as a borough, a burh. It does make you wonder what's going on at Meldreth. Going into the High Medieval period, 72% of the Meldreth test pits produce two or more sherds of High Medieval pottery. And again, you can see it's really high. Really high. The only place it's rivaling is Purton. And that'll rankle with you, I know. But interesting. And Binham. Binham up in Norfolk, Binham Priory is there. A lot of material turning up there. Well, you can just see it yourself really. It clearly is an important place, particularly because a lot of this doesn't. This is just registering pits with two or more sherds. You have a lot of pits that produce masses of pottery. So again, something very interesting going on there. And then what we see in the late medieval period, 47%. This is at post-Black Death. Most of the villages, you can see how much lower the figures are. This is the impact of the Black Death, the various disasters of the 14th century. I'll just go back to the previous one. You can see how high the figures on average are before the Black Death, and then how low they drop after it. But Meldreth, there's a drop, but it's still very high compared to regional averages. And then, interestingly, when we go into the post-medieval period, you can see how generally, I made the point that generally we get lots more pottery turning up from the post-medieval period. You can see how much higher the graphs are, sort of up to the 60s, 70s, 80s. On average, 50% or half the pits are produced pottery predating Victorian but post-dating medieval. Meldreth is exactly the same, 47% again. And you can see for the first time, Meldreth is actually more mid-table, shall we say. And again, there's a good question for the local historians amongst you there to explore that, how the local history and our understanding of the local history of Meldreth fits in and what's going on in the village in the post-medieval period that is keeping it ranking with everyone else. It isn't expanding. Maybe it was over-expanded in the medieval period, but there wasn't any scope for that. You can see how there's some really interesting questions coming out of that. When we turn the data upside down slightly and think about the percentage drop, although Meldreth is still doing very well in the late medieval period after the Black Death, it has dropped from, was it 72% to 47%. That's a big drop. You know, it's a drop of, well, 35% drop, really. And we can see that in this, the average drop is about 45%. This is the drop in the percentage of pits overall. You can see, again, this is the impact of the Black Death, really, on 14th century general problems. And Meldreth is sitting, it doesn't do, you know, it does better than average, but not that much better than average. And there are a few exceptional places, like Long Melford, again, which actually grow in this period. Nayland down near Sudbury is another village that grows considerably in this late period. So Meldreth, the extraordinary bits of Meldreth really, I think, are the Anglo-Saxon and High Medieval. And after that, I think it's following more general patterns, but from a much higher base, which has an enduring impact for a while, but gradually that sort of higher base, the impact of that tails off as it becomes more distant. Just to fit that into geographic patterns, this is the map with all of the villages where we've excavated more than 23 test pits. And it's the bigger the circle, the higher the percentage of pits with pottery. So there's Purton with lots of it, and Meldreth sitting in there as well. And what we can see here is the impact of the 14th century again, and you can see how these places shrink away, how much smaller those circles are. So say Nayland's an exception. But you can also see that Meldreth is doing an awful lot better than nearly all of its neighbours. So on average across the whole region, it's doing a bit better than average, but actually for this central, remember it's this sort of Anglo-Saxon crescent, is the crescent where the highest proportions of test pits are producing pottery in the High Medieval period. You can see the size of all these sites here. You can see how Meldreth is actually bucking that trend. So I think some interesting questions there. Especially when you bear in mind that these are the 4 sites that are actually growing, and you can see actually that Meldreth, with its the percentage of pits that it has, that 47%, is actually doing very well, considering. I'm going to skip over that because it's making the same point again. What's interesting as well when we start to map this against deserted settlements and see Meldreth in here, and look at our settlements here, the bigger the red circle, the bigger the decline. And the pattern we get from excavating in the existing villages is actually very similar to the distribution of deserted villages. So it does seem to be mimicking that pattern of late medieval decline and showing that the impact of events like the Black Death, famine, climatic deterioration and so on is actually having an impact on the villages that are still in existence today. You know, no one would visit Meldreth looking for a deserted village, but they clearly ought to be, because it clearly was badly affected, as indeed were nearly all of these villages. So, I'm going to stop now because I think you need lots of time to have a look at the finds. I've just put these up showing the way Meldreth relates to these regional averages as a summary. You can see, if you like, its great heyday in the Anglo-Saxon and High Medieval period. The glory days of 1,000 years ago, and I think you should be very proud of. But I think you should also be very, very proud of the huge amount of work and energy and effort that's gone in to the fact that you can now reconstruct your place in history from digging the tiny little fragments of the past from your gardens. And I wonder what's still out there. Thank you very much.